In the 20th century, when methods of execution became increasingly controlled and sterilized, botched executions would seem to have had real abolitionist potential. Newspaper coverage of botched executions to determine and describe the way they were presented to the public and why they have contributed little to the abolitionist cause. Although botched executions reveal pain, violence, and inhumanity associated with state killing, newspaper coverage of these events neutralizes the impact of that revelation. Throughout the last century, newspapers presented botched executions as misfortunes rather than injustices. We identify three distinct modes by which newspaper coverage neutralized the impact of botched executions and presented them as misfortunes rather than as systemic injustices. The dual narratives of sensationalism and recuperation in the early years of the 20th century, the decline of sensationalism and the rise of professionalism in the middle of the century, and the emphasis on balanced reporting toward the end of the century. There are 61 executions or attempted executions listed, 2 by asphyxiation, 10 by electrocution, and 49 by lethal injection, including 6 failed executions that were halted when execution personnel were unable to set an IV line. By botched, it means those involving unanticipated problems, or delays that caused at least arguably unnecessary agony for the prisoner or that reflect gross incompetence of the executioner. It is estimated that 3% of U.S. executions in the period from 1890 to 2010 were botched. The history of flawed executions in the U.S. during that period. Surratt reports that over those 120 years, 8,776 people were executed, and 276 of those executions, 3.15%, went wrong in some way. Lethal injection had the highest rate of botched executions. The electric chair is a specialized device used for capital punishment through electrocution. The condemned is strapped to a custom wooden chair and electrocuted via electrodes attached to the head and leg. Alfred Southwick, a Buffalo, New York dentist, conceived this execution method in 1881. It was developed over the next decade as a more humane alternative to conventional executions, particularly hanging. First used in 1890, the electric chair became a symbolic figure of capital punishment in the United States. The state of Georgia recorded all its executions since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty. Following is a transcript of Alpha Otis Stephens, DEC. 12, 1984 execution. Stephens was still breathing after the first jolt of electricity, so prison officials had to initiate a second electrocution. He was declared dead 19 minutes after the first surge of electricity hit his body. He had been sentenced to death for a murder committed during a 1974 burglary. Alpha Otis O'Daniel STEPHENS was convicted of murder in the Superior Court of Bleckley County on January 20 to 21, 1975, and sentenced to death. Stephens escaped from the Houston County, Georgia, jail and sometime thereafter on August 21, 1974, went to the home of Charles Aspell in Twiggs County, allegedly accompanied by another man. Charles Aspell was not at home at the time, and Stephens broke into the house, wherein he located a .357 Magnum pistol, which he loaded, and a number of other weapons, which he placed in a 1972 Dodge. While the burglary was proceeding, Roy Aspell, Charles Aspell's father, drove up in his Ford Ranchero. Stephens' later statement to officers was that Aspell said, "What are you doing in my house?" and seeing rifles in Stephens' automobile, pulled his gun. Stephens ran to Aspell's car, jerked Aspell out of the car, and hit him in the face several times. Aspell begged not to be hit anymore. Stephens is 6 feet, 2 inches tall, while Aspell was 5 feet, 6 inches, and at that time Asbel was crippled as the result of a tractor accident. Asbel usually carried several $100s on his person, and when he offered Stephens money in exchange for his life, Stephens took the offered money and kicked Asbel again. Stephens hit Asbel with the pistol, knocking him back into the Ranchero, and told his alleged partner to kill him if he moved. They drove approximately 3 miles to a pasture, where they stopped and Asbel got out of the car and tried to escape. He hobbled to an abandoned building being used as a barn, but Stephens took the .357 Magnum and ran after him. He took more money from Mr. Asbel and then placed the pistol in his ear and fired twice. Both bullets passed through Asbel's skull and exited at his right temple, causing his death. An autopsy showed that he sustained a broken jaw and several skull fractures. A trail of evidence connected Stephens to the crime. In pre-trial statements to police, he confessed this crime fully, as well as a string of other serious crimes which he committed after his escape and before the Asbel murder. He presented no defense at trial. During the hearing on sentence, however, he testified that his partner fired the fatal shots. Alpha Otis O'Daniel STEPHENS, convicted of murder and sentenced to death by the state of Georgia, appeals from a denial of a writ of habeas corpus. Alpha Otis O'Daniel STEPHENS contends his conviction violates the Double Jeopardy Clause, and his sentence is invalid under the Eighth Amendment, because closing arguments were not transcribed. The jury was not properly instructed that it could recommend a life sentence if it found aggravating circumstances, and the jury was permitted to consider an unconstitutional aggravating circumstance. Although we reject his other contentions, we agree that because the jury considered an unconstitutional aggravating circumstance, Alpha Otis Stephens' death sentence stand. Alpha Otis Stephens, executed by electrocution in Georgia on December 12, 1984. Alpha Otis Stephens was the 20th person to be put to death in the United States that year, and the third in Georgia. The first jolt of electricity, administered at 12:18 a.m., lasted 2 minutes, but when it was over, Mr. Stephens' chest was still heaving. Ralph Kemp, the prison warden, ordered another 2-minute jolt, and Mr. Stephens was pronounced dead at 12:37 a.m. Alpha Otis O'Daniel STEPHENS, he was 39 years old at the time of execution. He was convicted of murdering Roy Asbel, a Macon contractor, who interrupted a burglary. At the time of the killing, Mr. Stephens had escaped from prison where he was serving a life term for another murder. Thank you for watching Death Row.